Okay, wow, we are at the very last video in this Napoleonic Wars series. I can't believe it. I mean, we've been doing this for like, what, 3 or 4 months now, and we have gone through so many videos. There's so much that I have learned. When I started this series, I knew absolutely nothing about Napoleon, which is kind of hard to believe considering just how big of a figure he is in history. And to be honest, when I started this, I didn't know how much I would actually enjoy it because I've never really taken the time to study this period in history. But I have to say that I have really enjoyed it. We're not done. Like, I know this is the last video in the Napoleonic Wars series, but I hear that Epic History TV is going back and they're releasing soon the video on Vittoria, the Battle of Vittoria in Spain. So we're probably going to go back and take a look at that at some point. And we're also going to continue on with Napoleon's marshals. So this is not the end of Napoleon on this channel by any means, which means that Roger can still wear his hat for a little bit longer. So if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss anything coming up. Now, if you've been watching my videos on this channel, you know that when I do a series that I like to go back and revisit your comments from the previous video just because you guys answer all of my questions in the comments. And there's a lot of really great additional info, I feel like, as well. So we are going to take a look at just a handful of your comments from our last video. So a lot of you probably know that towards the end of the last video, I pretty much just lost my head. There was this whole strategy going on with Napoleon. He was trying to go behind enemy lines to cut off their lines of communication, and he just left like a free path to Paris, and I was like, what is going on? Why is he doing this? And yes, I did listen. I did hear like them lay out everything about like the secret communication and all of that. It was a lot of information coming at me really fast, and I just didn't have time to piece it all together while I was watching it my first time through. So I was having a hard time like understanding the whole strategy. And Estevez Film and Gaming says, as he said, Napoleon planned to cut the enemy's lines of communication, forcing them to abandon their advance on Paris. So yeah, at the time, I feel like I didn't quite understand that the Allies were not advancing on Paris because they thought it was too heavily fortified and didn't know that it wasn't. And Napoleon was gambling on them, you know, making that assumption. So he just kind of left Paris undefended and went behind enemy lines to try and gather his troops from elsewhere and bring them back and then take on the Allies, which was definitely a gamble on his part. But when the Allies got that secret communication from Paris saying that, hey, no, you guys can take Paris, it's not that heavily defended, then the Allies were like, you know what, screw it, we're just gonna go and we're gonna take Paris. And Napoleon had no idea that any of that was going on. So yeah, I don't think I quite understood why the Allies were not advancing on Paris and that they thought that it was too heavily defended. I don't know if he mentioned that in the last video. I feel like that was a little key piece of information that was not mentioned. I don't know. There was a lot to take in. But I really appreciate all of you guys who commented below and let me know kind of what the whole strategy was and kind of helped lay that out for me. It was extremely helpful, and now I understand. In the last video, they also mentioned the Bourbon kings in the south, and I was kind of like, so Napoleon was the emperor and there were still kings? But Anzac81 says the Bourbons were a royal family which had ruled France before the revolution, so I'm guessing that's like, you know, all the King Louis and that line, the ones that got their heads chopped off, and had also ruled Spain before Napoleon put his brother on the throne. Yes, I actually did a video yesterday on the Spanish Civil War, and they also mentioned the Bourbons in that. Like, the monarchy was reestablished and the Bourbons kind of came back into power. And I was kind of like, well, are those related to the Bourbons in France? And a lot of you said that yes, they were. So again, it's like one of those things previous to watching all of this stuff, I had no idea that the Bourbons even existed. So I also kind of made a mistake thinking that Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena out in the Atlantic the first time. I had no idea that he had been exiled twice and that he had escaped his first exile, so that was a bit of a surprise when I found that out in the comments. But Manu86 says, fun fact, when Napoleon left Elba, that little island had never been so well administered. That is one thing I've learned about Napoleon. He was very, very big on like almost micromanaging a bit. He liked organization, and so I believe it. I also had a question about how Napoleon was so good at military strategy and wondered if he had gone to a military academy. And Ivor the Homeless says he went to a military academy when he was in his teens and did study military strategy and tactics there. He also had about 20 years experience as an officer at this point and basically lived and breathed strategy. And to be honest, he was very naturally gifted as well, which I think, you know, all three factors combined made him such a good commander. Yeah, I mean, it's always usually like a combination of things. I am reading a Napoleon biography, but it's like 800 pages long, and I have to be very honest with you guys, I am not a reader. I have never been a big reader, but I do know the value of books, and I do know that there would be a huge value in getting through this book on Napoleon. I'm not super far into it, but I am trying to get through it, and I did just read about his time at the military academy, so I have a little bit more of a command of that now. Hunter27771 says, I'm reading Napoleon the Great at the moment. It's a biography of Napoleon, and it seems that Napoleon was a gigantic history nerd, and he basically didn't want to fraternize with the other students at his school. He preferred, you know, kind of reading alone by himself, and he really admired like Hannibal and Alexander the Great. So he had a big background on former leaders in history. Yeah, I actually just read about that in my biography that I'm reading too. I'm reading the Andrew Roberts biography of Napoleon, A Life, which is what it's called over here in the States. And they also talked about how he was kind of a loner a bit, and he really enjoyed reading a lot. And I think there was a quote in there where he basically said that when he read about all of these historical figures, he realized that he could do the same thing as them as well. So I guess that's what kind of inspired him to do what he did. I also had a question about France's borders in the last video. I always kind of like wonder what creates borders of countries. Massamoil says the Franco-Spanish border is predominantly the Pyrenees mountain range, and the border from Switzerland down to the Mediterranean basically consists of the Alps. So basically, I think it's the Rhine River at the top on the eastern front, on the eastern border of France, and then the Alps on the southern part of that, and the Pyrenees with between France and Spain. I've actually always heard of the Pyrenees mountain range, but I had no idea where it was located, so it's good to know. There was also a point in the last video where it talks about Napoleon manning the cannons himself, and I wondered if that was just out of desperation, like, because they were talking about how a lot of the troops that he had at that point were very inexperienced, and I just kind of wondered if he stepped in to kind of take over for them a little bit. Omar Bradley says Napoleon used to sight the cannons by himself on many occasions, Lodi being the most famous one, so it's very possible that what happened there was normally a way to show up your soldiers and say, if you will be killed, I will also be killed. So basically just kind of boosting their morale a little bit. And then somebody replied below that Napoleon used to man the guns early on in his career as well, so he could just kind of like, you know, had fun doing it. Early on in the video, there was a little machine with, it was a cartoon, you know, so I guess you couldn't take it too seriously. But it looks like they were torturing this guy, and he was like spitting out papers out of his mouth, and I thought it was like some weird torture machine. But Andrew Clayton lets me know that that torture machine was actually a printing press. That's why he was shown with decrees and proclamations coming out of his mouth. It was designed to press the sheet of paper into the inked printing plate. Quite innocent, really. Okay, so I was a little off with the torture device. I mean, he was being tortured in that photo, so I guess, you know, like that bit's right. I just got the machine wrong. And also, I did have a handful of comments from some of you that were like, the video explained the strategy at the end, you weren't listening. Look, you guys, it's not that I'm not listening. I am listening. I promise I am listening. But as I explained to one of those commenters, this is my first time watching all of this, and a lot of you watching these videos have seen them before, and you've probably already studied a lot of these battles, so you know what happens, and for you it's just quite all very, very easy because, like I said, you already know all of this stuff. Sometimes I can get things the first time around, but a lot of times I have to see or hear something multiple times for it to fully make its way into my brain and make sense. Even though they may have said it, that doesn't mean that I'm going to understand it perfectly right away. This happens to me too when I watch TV shows and movies. I get lost in the plot a lot. It's just the way my brain is. I can't explain it. It's kind of frustrating because sometimes I'll have to ask somebody like, wait, wait a second, what's going on? I don't know if I have like ADHD, which has been suggested to me before, but it could also just be the way my brain is wired, and I can't do a single thing about it. I promise. Like, I have tried. And it could also be that I was still trying to process a point that he had said already, and then when he says, all of this new stuff, I'm still trying to make sense of the old stuff, and it's just like, it just doesn't. So I apologize if you get annoyed by that. Again, there's nothing I can do about it. So I just appreciate your patience as I learn all of this stuff. And that's why I really appreciate your comments down below, because you do help sort me out in the end. All right, so we're going to leave it there with your comments. Right now, we're going to jump into the Battle of Waterloo. I did learn from a lot of your comments in the last video that Napoleon escapes from Elba, because I was like, how in the world does Waterloo happen if he's been exiled to Elba? Like, isn't he being held prisoner there? So he gets out and he goes back to France and tries to like regain his power there and fights another battle? Like, what? So you guys did explain that he escaped from Elba, and you also told me that this next video from Epic History TV doesn't really go into all of the details on how we got out of Elba, so that might have to be another video where I learn more about his exile and his escape from that exile. Also, I had no idea where Waterloo took place, and a lot of you let me know that it was in Belgium. Now, this is how ignorant of this I am, and I don't actually know like how Waterloo plays out. I don't know the details of the battle, so this could be right, maybe. Because the Battle of Waterloo has the word water in it, I've always assumed that it was like a naval battle, but I'm getting the sense that it's more of like a land battle. But since the British are involved and their thing was like the Navy, maybe it does involve a naval battle as well. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's Navy and land. Again, I did study this in school. I promise we do study the Battle of Waterloo over here, but I don't remember it. So I have actually no idea what to expect. I do know that since Napoleon gets exiled to St. Helena out in like the South Atlantic, he's not going to win the Battle of Waterloo. And all of you guys have kind of let me know, like, this is the big culmination of the Napoleonic Wars that you guys are really focused on in the UK, because you guys were directly involved in it and you guys win it. So I kind of like know what to expect, but again, not really. So we're just gonna go ahead and get into this. I'm done talking about it. I want to learn about what happens. This has been really built up by a lot of you, so I have high expectations. Some of you have said that it's a little bit overrated, but I don't know. We'll see.
April 1814. For 10 years, one man has dominated Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Under his military genius, France conquered an empire that spanned the continent. But finally, he has been defeated by a grand coalition of his enemies. Napoleon is forced to abdicate and exiled to the tiny island of Elba, while the Bourbon monarchy is restored to France in the corpulent form of Louis XVIII.
Oh,
but
okay.
rumors soon reached Napoleon that France would welcome his return. The French people have little love for the monarchy or its hangers-on, the very people whose excesses led to the French Revolution 25 years before. He also learns that at the Congress of Vienna, his enemies are locked in bitter dispute over the future of Europe. Napoleon decides to act. After just 10 months in exile, he returns to France, where the troops sent to arrest him rally to his cause instead. Most of France soon follows suit. But in Vienna, the coalition immediately put their differences to one side. They declare Napoleon an outlaw and mobilize their forces for war. Napoleon knows he must act boldly before the coalition launches a coordinated invasion of France. He counts on winning a quick victory and then negotiating peace from a position of strength. He targets the coalition armies within easiest reach: Prince Blucher's Prussian army and the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, both camped in Belgium.
Okay, so what are the British doing in Belgium? That's kind of like my question here. Do they have a colony in Belgium, or are they working with like the Belgian military. I don't know.
Napoleon's force is a match for either coalition army on its own.
Oh, 128,000,
But he'll
so...
be heavily outnumbered if they're able to join forces. So he must keep them apart and defeat each in turn.
So it looks like he pretty much has the entire French army behind him again. Man, they're missing a lot of information here. Like, wow, he just comes out of exile and then like takes over France again? There's a lot of info. We're definitely gonna have to go back and do another video on this because, wow. I wish they would have explained a little bit more about how he accomplished that. Intense drumming here. Oh, wow. This definitely looks different than their other videos. Some of you told me that it would.
Napoleon's army crosses the frontier near Charleroi, intending to drive a wedge between the two coalition armies. The next day, Napoleon sends his left wing under Marshal Ney to take the crossroads at Quatre Bras. There, Ney clashes with Wellington's army, still scrambling into position. The Allied troops fight off a series of French attacks, and just manage to hold their ground. The same day, Napoleon attacks Blücher's Prussian army with his main force, near the village of Ligny. The battle is a brutal slugging match, but the French emerge triumphant. The 72-year-old Blücher leads a cavalry charge in person and has his horse killed under him. He only just escapes capture. The Prussian army retreats, but it is not broken. Napoleon sends his right wing under Marshal Grouchy to keep them on the run, and turns his own attention to Wellington's army. The British general doesn't receive news of Blücher's defeat until the next morning, at which point he orders a retreat through heavy summer showers to a position 8 miles south of Brussels, near the village of Waterloo. There,
okay, so this is
he receives
inland.
a promise from Blücher that the Prussians will march to his aid the next morning. So Wellington decides to stand and fight.
And Waterloo's like a tiny little village, it looks like, too. Like, it's so pumped up in history as like this huge, huge thing. I thought it was gonna be like a city on the coast of Belgium, so there would be a navy involved, and it would be a much bigger city than this. So this is like completely blowing all of my expectations out of the water. Yeah, I just had no clue.
Wellington has chosen his battlefield with care. His troops are behind a gentle ridge which will give them some shelter from French cannon fire. His right flank is anchored on the farmhouse of Hougoumont, his center on the farm of La Haye-Sainte, and his left on the farm of Papelotte. All three are fortified and garrisoned with elite troops. Wellington's men need every advantage they can get. The opposing armies are roughly equal in size, but his is a ragtag mix of British, Dutch, and German troops, many of whom have never seen combat before. They will have to hold off Napoleon's army of veterans until Prussian reinforcements arrive, or the battle and probably the war will be lost. Sunday dawns bright and fair. Napoleon has ordered Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and keep them busy, while he defeats Wellington's army at Waterloo and opens the road to Brussels. But it's Grouchy who gets pinned down, fighting the Prussian rearguard at Wavre. The main Prussian force eludes him and is already marching to Wellington's aid. At Waterloo, Napoleon delays his attack, waiting for the ground to dry, which will make movement easier for his troops. But the lost hours will later prove costly. The battle begins around 11 a.m., when Napoleon orders a feint against Wellington's right flank at Hougoumont. He hopes Wellington will commit his reserves here, drawing them away from the centre, where the main blow will fall. But Hougoumont British and German defenders cling on desperately throughout the day. At one point, the French force their way through the main gate, but it's shut behind them, and the intruders are all killed. Wellington later calls it the decisive moment of the battle. Around noon, 80 French cannon open fire against the main Allied line. Most of Wellington's men are out of sight on the reverse slope, but many cannonballs still find their mark, smashing bloody holes in the Allied ranks. At 1:30 p.m, Napoleon sends in his infantry. The French columns are met by disciplined musket fire, and then charged by British heavy cavalry. The French attack disintegrates as Napoleon's men try to save themselves from the crushing hooves and flashing sabres. Scores of Frenchmen are ridden down, and 2 of their famous Eagle standards are captured. But
This is interesting to me, because usually when Napoleon takes on battles like this, he doesn't have any trouble. He doesn't have this much trouble. In previous videos, he seems to do really, really well in battles like this. So, you know, I guess this is a contingent of, what he said, the British and the German and the Dutch. Are they just that good? You know, are they just good enough that Napoleon is having this trouble with him? Or is Wellington outmaneuvering Napoleon? Because I don't feel like it's outmaneuvering necessarily. These feel like very straightforward tactics. So it just seems like maybe the Anglo-Allied army here is just a bit too good for Napoleon.
But the British cavalry, exhilarated by success, charge too far. They become scattered, their horses blown. At their most vulnerable, they're countercharged by French cavalry and suffer terrible losses.
Okay, I spoke too soon.
Among the dead, Major General Sir William Ponsonby, commander of the Union Brigade. Around 4 p.m, Marshal Ney thinks he sees the Allies begin to retreat and leads a mass cavalry charge to drive home the advantage. But Ney is wrong. The Allied infantry are ready, formed in hollow squares with bayonets fixed.
I have to say, looking at this picture right here, the British troops, I've always liked their uniforms. They look very, very smart in these red uniforms. Yeah, even like studying the Revolutionary War, you know, here in the States and seeing like movies and stuff with the British, they always look really good.
The French cavalry can't break into these impregnable formations. They can only circle impotently until they retreat or are shot from the saddle. Ney's failure to support this attack with either infantry or artillery is a serious blunder. Meanwhile, Blücher's Prussians have begun to arrive. They capture the village of Plancenoit, threatening Napoleon's flank and forcing him to send reserves to recapture it. Around 6 p.m, French infantry finally capture the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center of the battlefield. It allows the French to bring forward artillery and blast the Allied squares from close range. They can't miss the closely packed formations, and casualties quickly mount. It begins to seem that if Wellington's army doesn't retreat, it will be killed where it stands. But the situation for Napoleon is also desperate. The Prussians are arriving in force, and he's running out of men to throw against Wellington's army. So he turns to his ultimate reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, the most feared troops in Europe. At 7:30 p.m, 3,000 of these battle-hardened veterans march past their emperor and across the corpse-strewn battlefield towards the Allied center. Wellington's redcoats rise to meet them and pour devastating volleys of musket fire into their ranks. When the Allies fix bayonets and prepare to charge, the Imperial Guard wavers and then retreats. Wellington, sensing victory, orders a general advance. About the same time, the Prussians recapture Plancenoit. News of the Imperial Guard's defeat and rumors of encirclement by the Prussians sweep through the French ranks. Panic breaks out, and the French army flees the battlefield. Only Napoleon's old guard maintained their discipline, mounting a heroic but doomed rearguard action.
Yeah, why? Why would you stay in that situation?
Napoleon himself is forced to abandon his carriage and barely escapes the pursuing Prussian cavalry. The battle is won. The Duke of Wellington and Prince Blücher meet and congratulate each other outside Napoleon's former headquarters, an inn called La Belle Alliance. Blücher thinks it's the perfect name for their shared victory, but Wellington prefers the more English-sounding Waterloo, where he has his own headquarters. The Battle of Waterloo was, in the words of the Duke of Wellington, a damned near-run thing. It was also one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Around 50,000 men were killed or wounded, 23,000 coalition casualties, 27,000 French. Due to an appalling shortage of medical care, many of the wounded were left lying on the battlefield for several days. Napoleon was utterly defeated. Unable to raise another army, he surrendered to the British. They transported him to a second exile on the tiny, remote Atlantic island of St. Helena. This time there was no escape. He died there 6 years later.
6 years later? Wow, that's a short life.
Waterloo marked the beginning of a period of relative peace in Europe. There were no wars between the great powers for 40 years, and the British would not fight on the continent for another 100 years, until the summer of 1914.
Wait, the Crimean War was 1854 to 56? Why did I think that was a 20th century war?
40 years after the battle, a pioneer in the new art of photography captured these remarkable images. They're veterans of Napoleon's armies, by then all old men in their 70s and 80s.
Really?
Among them, Sergeant Tania of the Imperial Guard, Moray of the 2nd Regiment of Hussars, and Verline of the 2nd Guard Lancers. These faces are a tantalizing link to the dramatic events that shaped the course of history 2 centuries ago.
Man, I can't imagine fighting a war in those, like, huge hats. Okay, well, there we have it. I feel like I had a couple of questions that I didn't want to pause the video and ask, and now I've forgotten what I was gonna ask. So that's why I paused during the video, so that I don't forget stuff. But yeah, that was nothing like I was expecting it to be. Not in a bad way. I just had this idea of what Waterloo was in my head, and I think it was like way more, like I said, like a huge epic naval battle, or at least like a coastal battle in a much bigger city. I don't know, like I had a very, very different image of it in my head that was completely inaccurate. The Battle of Waterloo, obviously the British decided to name it Waterloo, but is it known as that other name in other countries, or have all the countries basically adopted the name Waterloo for this battle? Also, 50,000 soldiers died. Like, that is a huge, huge amount. I mean, that's getting up to like Borodino levels almost, I believe. It's just kind of crazy that all of those people had to die just because Napoleon decided to come back and try this one more time for no reason either. I mean, it just seemed like he was up against a very insurmountable opposition. By this point, pretty much all of Europe was allied against him, so he would have I mean, I feel like it was taking a miracle for him to be able to pull off what he wanted to pull off, but maybe he thought he could really do it. I don't know, like, but it's just a shame that that many people had to die because of the ego of one guy. And I was also thinking, like, what was Napoleon's aim in all of this? And I guess this is the question about all dictators or emperors that basically invade and try to take over all of these countries. Like, what is the end game? Is it just for the sake of power? Like, you just want to have that much power over other people? Is it for a monetary gain? You know, like you acquire this land and you get all of their resources and, you know, you get rich? Is it because you're wanting to improve, you know, life in some way that you think it needs to be improved, and so you want to just kind of take control and implement that? I guess it's probably a combination of all three, but knowing that all of that's going to happen at the, you know, cost of a ton of lives and devastation, like, I don't know, like, you have to have some kind of weird messed up ego to go through with it. And so yeah, so Europe got 40 years of peace after that, and then they were back to war again. I guess it just proves that it's really hard for human beings to be at peace for a very long time. For some reason, we always have to find some excuse for a war of some sort. I mean, I know for the US, it seems like every couple of decades we've got some new war that we're fighting. So I guess that's the Battle of Waterloo. Again, I do want to go back and probably watch more about Napoleon's exile and how he got off of Elba. Somebody kind of mentioned that he snuck onto a ship or something like that. So, but yeah, there was a lot of information that was just glossed over. So anyway, as I said before, we're not done with Napoleon. We're going to do the Marshall series and then probably go back and watch 2 or 3 more videos to fill in some gaps that we missed in this series. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. And also I have some social media if you would like to follow me there. Roger and I thank you as always for watching, and we hope you will join us next time.